Hello, good morning. Here is another BIOL3465 Tropical Forest Ecology and Use lecture. This one is entitled History of Tropical Forest Management, and in this we're going to go through the history of how tropical forests have been managed in the past and to the present day and possibly into the future. I'll take a look at a couple of the concepts of what I think management of natural renewable resources are, and the concept of how tropical forests need to be managed correctly to remain renewable. And we'll talk a little bit too about how humans use natural resources, both in a Western context, Western economic context, but also in a traditional pre-Western colonization context as well. And it doesn't look good for the people. Okay, so what we're going to do is to take a look at what is tropical forest management. We'll take a look at what renewable resources are, and we'll take a look at what management of those renewable resources are. We'll take a look at the stages in the use of renewable natural resource. There always seems to be a pattern of stages through which humans go when they're using a renewable natural resource. They'll start with just exploiting it, then they'll start into managing it when it starts running out, and finally, if the commodity becomes so valuable, then domestication and plantation is quite often the end result. We'll take a look at uses of tropical forests in pre-colonial times, in the colonial times, and post-colonial times. We've looked a little bit about this before. And finally, we'll take a look at management of tropical forests today. So, first of all, what is tropical forest management? Okay, so tropical forest management, a branch of natural resource management which concerns itself with tropical forests, obviously. Now, natural resources, as you probably know, are usually classified as resources which can be taken from the environment for human use and for humans to modify or change and create some sort of wealth or good which they can use in their societies to survive. The economic principles underlying Western economic systems say that natural resources are in effect infinite, which is a nonsense, but there you go, that's what underpins our natural economic systems. Natural resources are not infinite, but there are some natural resources which, if managed correctly, can more or less be infinite. In other words, they can renew themselves and they can be used indefinitely, but only if they are managed in the correct way. Some natural resources are not renewable, and there you have probably the first dichotomy in natural resources, renewable and non-renewable natural resources. Forest resources generally tend to be renewable. So forest resources are generally based on biotic components like trees or animals or plants, and if you harvest a tree, an animal or plant, if you don't damage the ecosystem, then the ability of that tree, animal or plant to regenerate itself is usually not disrupted, and the commodity will renew itself. But that third point is very important. The renewability of natural resources is very much dependent on harvesting it in such a way that its ability to renew is not compromised. And to do this, we need to understand the ecology of this natural resource. If we don't understand how this natural resource, this particular species of plant, animal, or tree, relates to its environment and the other components of its ecosystem, then we will not understand how much of this resource we can use before it starts to become depleted and it cannot regenerate itself to mean that harvesting can continue into the future. So a simple example of that would be if we want to go into the forests of Trinidad and harvest crapo trees. Crapo trees are in the Meliaceae family, and they are very valuable for furniture making and so on, so it's quite a valuable timber wood, a class 1 timber species. We need to understand why crapo trees, or how crapo trees regenerate themselves, so we understand how much crapo trees we can take out and how much we can modify the ecosystem and not compromise the ability of crapo trees to regenerate. Now that brings us on to another important point when it comes to renewable natural resources. When humans get to know the ecology of these renewable natural resources, quite often, if the wish is to increase the supply of this renewable natural resource, what can be done is the ecosystem can be modified to favor this renewable natural resource so you can get more of it. So the ecosystem can be modified to a greater or lesser degree to promote the renewable natural resource in question, and so you can get more of it. An example of that, again with our crapo, would be if we cleared away all the other species in that tropical forest in Trinidad and we just planted crapo seedlings throughout that forest. So we only had crapo trees growing. So when we went into that forest and we harvest crapo trees, all we were getting was crapo trees. And so the amount of resource we're going to get out of there is maximum crapo resource. And that, as you probably may gather, is known as a plantation. So we would do that, say, with teak and pine. But we don't do it with crapo, even though crapo is a very valuable timber. And I'm going to ask you to wait to understand why we don't establish plantations of crapo trees in Trinidad. One thing to note, though, is that the greater the modification of the ecosystem, the greater the amount of human inputs required. So if we need to eliminate all the other species in our forest and just have crapo, we have to spend a lot of money to clear all the other trees and remove them, all the other plants, and we need to spend a lot of money to regenerate the crapo, to produce the crapo seedlings to plant. And once we harvest the crapo, we need to go back and replant the crapo seedlings and so on. So that means that humans have to do a lot. They have to pay for a lot of inputs, removing all the other trees which may compete with the crapo, and planting all the crapo seedlings and raising all the crapo seedlings. So the greater the modification of the ecosystem, the more inputs which are required. And the endpoint of that sort of thing would be an agricultural system where humans would go in and eliminate all the plants in that ecosystem by spraying and by ploughing, and they would just plant the crop species and then they will go through and spray all the weeds to keep them back and just allow the crop species to grow. They may even provide fertilizer and irrigation to allow that crop species to grow. And so in that way humans are extremely modifying that ecosystem, and they are paying a lot of money to do it, because all of those things cost a lot of money. Okay? So, tropical forest management is the management of tropical forests to produce tropical forest products for a consumer, but to maintain the ecosystem processes so that tropical forests can continue producing. So, tropical forest management can encompass a natural tropical forest in which you only take out a small number of stems of a particular tree and leave the rest, and leave the forest functioning normally, and so the crapo trees will regenerate themselves. Or tropical forest management may mean clearing the whole forest and planting it with seedlings of your preferred species. As long as those processes of regeneration and growth continue, then that ecosystem can still continue producing. But as you can see, the more the ecosystem is modified, the more inputs need to be put in. So when it comes to tropical forests, because they are usually over such large areas, the key there is usually minimal change to the ecosystem, so that the trees, the species which are favored for harvesting, can be maintain themselves without additional inputs from humans. So the only expense then from humans is to actually go in there and harvest and extract the timber. Alright, I just want to talk about some of the different stages in the use of natural resources before we get on to forest use in different parts of the world over time. Okay, stages in the use of natural resources. I don't think that this is written down anywhere, but it certainly seems to be the case. I read a book by a chap called Tim Flannery, Dr. Tim Flannery, I think it's Professor Tim Flannery now. He wrote a book called The Future Eaters. If you get time, go and take a look at it. I think I might have it in the supplemental readings up on My Learning. Basically, he looks at how humans utilize natural resources around the world, and the records, both archaeological and historical, of how human society had used natural resources over time. And he found that there were distinct stages in the uses of those natural resources over the time. The first stage was exploitation. Now, exploitation was basically defined in this case as use without management. So the natural resource was identified, a value was put on it by being able to extract it and transport it to a market and get a price for it. And at that stage, the resource became had a value attached to it, and so in the forest it was taken out and transferred to a market. There was no thought to future harvesting, only that you may need to move to a different part of the forest to harvest more of this particular natural resource. So this seems to be the case for many natural resources, not only forest natural resources, but also fisheries, also wild animals, large game animals, all through history, both in the case of prehistory, before European civilization, before European colonization, and during European colonization. There's been a trend where when the natural resource first has a value applied to it, it is used unsustainably. In other words, it is just mined out of the ecosystem. A case in point in Trinidad would be the cedar tree. Cedar in forests of Trinidad are fairly rare. In the historical records, this wasn't always the case. There was quite often, there were reports of cedar being fairly common in the rainforests of Trinidad. But by the time comprehensive records of the numbers of species in tropical rainforests in Trinidad were compiled in the early 1900s, the amount of cedar trees in the forests was very much reduced. That's because cedar was a very important timber tree, a very valuable timber tree. Surprisingly, it's not just Trinidad which has a cedar tree which is very valuable. In the east coast of Australia, there was a cedar tree called red cedar, and it grows in the tropical and subtropical rainforests of the east coast of Australia. So from Victoria all the way up to North Queensland, you would find the red cedar trees in tropical rainforests and subtropical rainforests. The first natural resource which was exploited in these areas was this cedar. This cedar came known as red gold. Cedar getters would take boats and journey into the wilderness to find this red cedar tree. They would go up into the subtropical rainforests and they would fell as many red cedar trees as they could find, and they would put the logs into the nearest river, and if there wasn't a river around, well, they couldn't harvest the cedar, and they would just wash those cedar trees downstream to ports, and where they were put on ships and quite often shipped up to the centre of empire, which at that time was London. Before too long, the cedar was extracted, it was extirpated from around the main points of colonisation like Sydney and Brisbane, and so the cedar getters needed to go further and further afield. And as I said, they were quite often the first Europeans to arrive in those areas to exploit this cedar. Before too long, cedar became depleted. There was no more cedar left. A few of the cedar getters made huge amounts of money, and they moved into some other way of life, some other resource exploitation. At that point, the government, which had a vested interest in maintaining the cedar trade because they could claim tax on it and so on, decided to try and manage the resource. Also, because the cedar occurred mainly in forests which the government claimed for itself. So they started to institute management measures like only a certain number of cedar trees could be taken out of an area, leaving enough other cedar trees to hopefully regenerate that cedar resource. Because of the remoteness of the locations of the cedar getters, though, however, management wasn't all that effective, and the cedar numbers declined dramatically. So the government tried to do the next best thing, and that was to declare huge areas of the forest as out of bounds for timber extraction, put in national parks and so on. And a similar sort of deal also occurred here in Trinidad as well. The government also tried to set up domestication of this resource. They tried to understand the ecology of cedar and tried to understand how they could establish plantations of cedar, so the valuable timber could be constantly available at a fairly large amount. So this domestication is the logical endpoint of natural resource use. You can see this also in other natural resources, to greater or lesser success. Fisheries are a good example. Quite often when a new fishery is discovered, so a fish is brought up, taken to market, the market responds positively to it, it puts a value on that fish species, then the fishery is essentially open for business. And fishermen will gear up their boats to go and harvest this particular species. And they will fish it as much as they can and get as much as they can so that they can make the maximum amount of money. But what inevitably happens then is the fishery becomes damaged. Too many fish are taken, and the populations of this fish can no longer regenerate, and so that fishery collapses. And this has happened in the past on a massive scale. In the North Atlantic there were massive fisheries of cod and salmon, and these fisheries were so large that huge industries were based upon them. However, because so many cod were extracted, the fisheries basically collapsed, and there wasn't enough a density of cod available in the oceans anymore, which allowed fishermen to fish enough, to get enough to sustain themselves. Excuse me. So management needed to be instituted. Sorry, excuse me. Okay, sorry about that. This virus still has a little bit of a hold on me. Alright, so exploitation. And you see this with lots of different natural resources. In prehistory, the extinction of megafauna in North America and in Europe was thought to have occurred because of human hunters arriving and preferentially hunting out all these large game animals which were the preferred prey. And it's only some of the large megafauna like cows and so on which were domesticated, and horses and so on, which were saved from extinction. Alright, so I'm going to refer to these stages in natural resource management and go back to them as I talk about exploitation or management of tropical forest resources. So in the pre-colonial times, forest use was mainly for uses other than timber production, mainly for hunter and gatherer and shifting cultivation, which we've talked about. There was low intensity timber use, house construction, canoes, medicines, cultural artifacts, but mainly things like nuts and fruits and berries and hunting of wild meat and so on. Actual commercial forestry or harvesting trees for their timber in historical records started around 2,000 years ago in the Mediterranean and in East Asia, mainly for shipbuilding. Now ships were very important for trade, and trade was how human societies accumulated wealth. They did this by locating natural resources or other resources in different parts of the world, building ships to be able to go and find these resources, collect them, and bring them back to where they would be more valuable. And a ship needed to be built out of timber. So in the Mediterranean, cedar, another type of cedar, this is the cedars of Lebanon, which are more of a pine tree or a conifer tree rather than the cedar that we know, but the same red, rich, very easily worked timber, however. These cedars of Lebanon were very good for shipbuilding, and the Phoenician Empire was basically based on ships which were harvested from these forests. That's in the eastern Mediterranean. Those forests were basically logged out very quickly over the course of a few hundred years, and there are very few patches of cedar forests in the eastern Mediterranean anymore. In northern Europe, a similar sort of pattern occurred. In England, for instance, a lot of English power and trade in the English Empire, which really reached its height around Queen Victoria's time, but really started around Queen Elizabeth's time in the 1500s, I believe. Ships were the mainstay of the trade and controlling the trade routes, and for that, pretty much all the oak trees in England were harvested to outfit merchant fleets and navy fleets. So much so that there were very few resources left for constructing ships by the 1700s, and the European powers, part of the reason for their expansion to different areas was to try and find timber to build ships. One of the first reasons why it was thought that the Danish reached North America was to find very tall, straight trees for masts for ships. As you can imagine, tall, straight trees were very rare, and so masts were very rare. So finding a place which has very tall, straight trees was of great interest to these colonial powers. So colonial forest use did have a lot to do with timber production, but colonial forest use was also focused on other commodities besides timber. So things like rubber was very important. Cinnamon, spices were also very important colonial renewable resource uses. The valuable trees which were harvested for export, things like Brazil wood, rosewood, or mahogany, were very valuable, and they were initially harvested like the red cedar in eastern Australia. They were mined out of the ecosystem. One of the reasons why during early colonial period these resources were just used, exploited without thought for management was, first of all, it really did seem like the ecosystems which these plants grew in were endless. Nobody really had a good idea of how big the resource was. This was an age of exploration. There were a lot of blank areas on the map, nobody knew exactly how big the forests were. So nobody knew how much of the Brazil wood or mahogany wood or rosewood there was, because nobody knew how big the forests were. So initial mining and exploitation of these rare trees without thought for where the next lot was going to come from in 10 years' time was the norm for the day. As the colonial period progressed and there was a better understanding of the size of the resource, much more long-term systems were set up to manage these natural resources, because it soon became clear that they were not infinite and they would be exhausted if they were continued to be used at the same rate at which they were being used. Also, this early colonial period transferred into the empire period, where small colonies grew and grew to form large empires, so that the natural resources were thought to be exploited by these colonial powers for a long period of time. So the managers of these forests began to get the idea that they were going to be there for the long run. So if they wanted that natural resource to be there into the future, they better start managing it. The resources, more resources became available to market because transport became more efficient. So more different types of timber could be transported to markets in Europe. However, during the colonial period, extraction was not mechanized. It was mainly animal driven, as we've seen before. So the areas and the impact tended to be relatively low compared to the effects we see today. And the main way in which tropical forests were impacted was the transference or the modification of these tropical forest ecosystems into plantations. So these plantations, in Trinidad for example, much of the interior forests, which had survived up and all through the Spanish period, right up until the 1800s when the British took over, was converted into cocoa plantation progressively. So that even though there was still a treed ecosystem, the cocoa tree and its support ecosystem was favored above all the other species of tree. And that's what we see in Trinidad today. So large areas of forest which were accessible were logged and then converted to some plantation system so that a particular natural resource could be extracted from that area during the colonial system. And this was the period where there were a lot of plantations for different commodities, not just timber. Alright, then there was World War II. And World War II basically marked the end of the colonial or the empire period. This was the point where the morality of the world, the ethics of the world had changed enough so that it was deemed better for everybody to have an equal opportunity, and that meant independence for many of the former colonies. So these new countries were no longer supported by a network of economic systems and trade focused on an empire, and that was both a blessing and also a bit of a disadvantage. Whereas before they had basically a captive market, so they could always sell their natural resources to the center of the empire and still find protection for their transport of their goods and still find a market there, which was protected from other parts of the world. Now, with independence, they could no longer rely on that. So the management of natural resources had to be much more efficient and had to be much cheaper. So these newly independent countries needed to find ways in which they could build their tax base, as I've said before, and so increase the amount of money they had for their people. At the same time, during World War II, there were great advances in mechanization, in the development of vehicles and so on, so that forests became more open to exploitation. Particularly after World War II, there remained a shortage of timber in the developed countries, the biggest consumer markets of the world. And this wasn't new, but with mechanization, the supply of timber suddenly became much more available to these markets, and this timber was supplied from tropical regions, which were opened up by mechanization. And I think I've talked about these things before. So these new political systems meant more local control of natural resources, but also a greater need to produce return from these tropical forests than had existed before in colonial times. So that brings us up to the current day. Non-timber tropical forest use is much less important today than it was in the past. The mechanization of the forests mean that this timber resource became the most important economically from forests. So instead of converting the forest into a plantation and using capital to do that, now business people could exploit the forest just by going in there, building a few roads and extracting all the timber and make massive amounts of money. So mechanization meant that timber became the predominantly important resource from tropical forests. And that still continues today, and I'll talk about that on the next slide. I'll talk about non-intensive, small-scale, non-mechanized timber harvesting is carried out by local people for things like canoes and carvings. So there is still some non-mechanized use of timber, and that is the traditional timber harvesting for small-scale projects and items like houses and canoes, which are not transferred over very large distances. And then there's the intensive, large-scale mechanized timber harvesting, which is usually carried out by multinational timber companies which have markets in the developed world, and they're able to transfer this timber from the source in tropical forests to these markets. Either way, preferred species get too rare or isolated for small-scale efforts, and more timber species are being used by the consumer. So the tropical forests are gradually being exploited, and many of them are still in the exploitation phase today. So intensive timber harvesting is heavily mechanized with skidders and large transport trucks. Tropical forest management systems were developed but have usually been abandoned. Now the reason for that is because we are still in that exploitation phase, and for multinational companies, timber producers, which are quite often the only organizations which have enough money to develop the resource, in terms of the skid trails and the transport and the equipment for transport and so on. They have no interest in minimizing their profits so that they can sustainably harvest a forest. They want to maximize their profits, and that means harvesting unsustainably, opening up the canopy, causing the humidity to fall, allowing the R-selected species to choke out the K-selected species, and generally messing up the ecosystem so it can no longer sustainably produce timber. So the idea of sustainable management of tropical forests, although it has tried to be instituted in many parts of the tropics, still remains a bit of a pipe dream, still remains a ideal. And because the international timber companies can minimize their costs by just going to a next tropical forest, once they're finished with West Africa, they could move to the Philippines. Once they're finished with the Philippines, they can move to Malaysia. Once they're finished with Malaysia, they can move to Indonesia. Once Indonesia is done, they'll move to Guyana. Once Guyana is done, they'll have the Amazon basin to finish up. But natural resources, as you all know, are not infinite. And there are people who are seeing that this exploitation must come to an end. And it is likely that it will come to an end within the next 20 to 50 years' time. And that is when all the available forest has been logged over. So, at that point, tropical timber resources are going to become very scarce. And when they become very scarce, those tropical timber resources are going to be very expensive. So, in different areas of the tropics today, and I can speak about the northern tropics of Australia, where it is very seasonal, they are actually establishing plantations of tropical hardwoods like mahogany, cedar, and some of the other tropical hardwoods, crapo too, I think. And they are establishing them in very deciduous dry areas, and they're using irrigation to grow these trees. And this was about 10 years ago. There was a big wave of tropical timber plantations started. This is from businessmen who could see that tropical timber is going to run out in the future. And so these big plantations were being established so that they would have producing plantations at the time when the price of timber had begun to rise. And you're actually beginning to see the start of that rise in timber prices today. Part of it is due to better management of the remaining tropical forests. So tropical country governments and organizations like the UNDP and UTTO are trying to put in place better management practices for these forests. And these usually restrict the ability of these international timber companies to maximize their profits and make sure that they have to plow money back into the management of these forests. This increases the price of the timber, it increases the cost to produce this timber, and that drives the price of the timber up. So the price of timber around the world is increasing for two reasons. First of all, the areas where you can get readily available timber are dwindling now. And secondly, the areas which are remaining are much better managed than they were in the past. But in places like Papua New Guinea and Guyana, however, the exploitation phase still continues, unfortunately. So in summary then, pre-colonial ties, non-timber products were very important. In colonial times, forestry techniques for timber production were adapted, and today timber production tends to be the most economic use of tropical forests, mainly because of mechanization. Okay, thank you very much.